then the second piece was the importance of being the marketing department. So I was a bit naive with my first book. I think it came out in 2012 or 13. I can't remember. And that was when publishing had really massively shifted just a few years before, to where they were not putting the same money in that they used to for marketing. And I remember several people saying, "You are the marketing department." But I still, in my own cluelessness, I say, thought, I think the publisher is going to do more. And on the first book, they didn't. They did exactly what they said they were going to do, and I didn't pick up the marketing piece and go after it myself. The second book is where I learned how important that is. And so anytime I speak with authors now, especially first-time authors, I repeat to them over and over, you are the marketing department, and really help them think through what are the best ways to get your message out, how to do that with clarity, how to stay on point, because it's incredibly important, as many of you know, to really be the one who's pounding the pavement and getting the message of your book out there.
Michael, when I often engage with an author, at the outset, I ask, so what's your book about? And the response is often and it's kind of a staccato. Let's talk about let's slide into your speaking coaching function. What do writers need to know about speech, about telling their story?
Yeah.
The
Well, you
disjunctive,
have
right?
you have to take those 40,000 words or however long your book is and boil it down to one sentence. And I'm not talking about an elevator pitch. That's too long. Elevator pitch is where you get 30 seconds to 60 seconds. This is literally boiling it down to one sentence. And the beauty of that is if you can really dial in that one sentence, it really becomes the structure for what will be and can be your talk, or a couple of different talks that you can do depending on the audience that you're speaking to. And when I do my online workshops or I'm working one-on-one with a client, one of the things, especially authors, always come back to of like, I can't get this down to one sentence. It feels paralyzing because we just had 40,000 words to work with. Now you're telling me I have 10 to 12. So what I do is I ask them first, when you think about the sentence, what's the problem or the issue or the topic you're writing about? You would not write a book, especially a nonfiction book, if you were not addressing some sort of issue, topic, problem that exists in our world. So think about that. What's the one problem you're addressing? Then second, what are the solutions or the insights you're bringing? And I imagine in your books like mine, there's several different solutions that you're bringing or insights you're pointing to. But really, what's the foundation of all of those? And if you can get that one solution, that's really the second part of the sentence. So you have the problem, solution, and then third, what will life look like? In other words, why would people care? Why do people need to hear what you have to say? And if they take in what you're saying, what can their life look like? So an example of that is I'm working with someone right now who's doing a lot of speaking around giving and receiving feedback in the workplace. And she came back to me, I just got this a few days ago, with her sentence that says, her talk is, feedback is a gift, and if we approach it well, our teams and organizations will thrive. So now she's building her entire talk on why is feedback a gift? What does it look like to approach it well? And what will it look like if teams and organizations thrive? And if you can narrow that down, especially as you're reaching out to potential speaking opportunities, talking to different people, whether it's event planners or pastors or whoever it is to bring you in to speak, and you're that clear and concise, you're then going to begin getting questions about going deeper with that. And if that's your framework, you're really on your way to having a great talk.
Yeah, yeah. I spoke with an author recently in the military setting who has a wonderful book, but has one speaking gig on the horizon. And so, what opportunities exist for writers to talk more about their work, whether it's Zoom calls, Instagram Live talks? What's out there for an author?
Yeah, I think the first question is a little bit of what you asked before, Don, is like, well, what's your message? and how is it connecting, and how are you making sure the message connects to the audience that you're pitching the idea to? So for example, right now in the tech industry, um, I know of three different speakers who are trying to bring a talk about burnout, because burnout in the tech industry, according to the Society for Human Resource Management, is over 70%. Um, but the tech industry is not interested in that at all. So they keep pursuing this talk, but they're getting crickets in response, because right now all the tech industry wants to talk about is AI. So I think that's the really first important piece, is who is it that you're writing for? When I wrote, one of the pieces of advice I got from an established author was, imagine you're writing a letter to an individual. And so then the question becomes, well, where are those individuals? Where are those people that I want to speak to that are going to buy my book? And so having that consistent message and knowing the audience are really important. But the other thing I'm learning in that is that live speaking is an incredible opportunity. I have a really close friend who, he's kind of the brains behind a lot of big time concerts, of big time artists. And I asked him about AI, and he said, nothing will replace the concert experience. You can create all the music you want, but if you can't play it in front of a crowd and perform, it won't matter. And so he and I started talking about that human connection, that Zoom is Zoom. Here we are. Podcasts and all those other things are great, but being live in front of an audience, there's nothing like it, because there is a connection that happens. There's authenticity that comes through in a way that it's more difficult to establish when you're on a video call. And sales and speaking go hand in hand. So I found when I got out speaking more with my second book, and I would go stand by the book table, a lot of people wanted to talk to me, and then they would look down and my book's right there. And it was a lot easier to sell that, to get that message out more and more. And when it does come to podcasts or interviews or even retreats, I led a few different retreats based around my second book. Having that consistent message from live platform to podcast to interviews is incredibly important. That's also the importance of what is called media training. If you've never done that, it's another thing that's incredibly important to have in your back pocket. I'd also say, don't be afraid to invite yourself in. People are more open than you think. As someone who was a pastor for so long, I know it's great to have somebody take a Sunday off your hands and they can preach the sermon and you get to promote their book, and it's a wonderful deal. But a lot of people are more open than you think. Just make sure it's the right audience that you're pursuing.
Yeah, that's so true. I well remember, oh, this is 15 years ago, maybe more, being at the Staples Arena Theater, whatever it was, in LA with Francis Chan, and he was speaking, and his book hadn't come out yet. And just hearing in the buzz, this guy was really good. Does he have a book? And how many times have we probably experienced that, where we've gone to an event, we've heard a speaker and go, we turn to each other, or we're on the phone looking on Amazon, what has Hidalgo written recently, kind of thing. Um, there's people here who are fiction writers, and I know you haven't written a novel yet, uh, but speak to help the fiction writers process how they can be a speaker on a topic on their story.
Yeah, well, I have a background in screenwriting, so I know a little bit about fiction writing. Um, but the question becomes, what's your story ultimately about? What is it pointing to? What are the values that are driving it? What's the narrative pushing it forward? And people, one of the things I've discovered with the talk is it's not just about learning to tell good stories, but it's about making the story, or the entire talk, feel like a story. And so the whole thing is moving forward towards some sort of resolution. And so in some ways, fiction writers, you're better positioned when it comes to giving a powerful talk, because you can take an element of the story that you've written about. You could take one character and walk us through. But it still really is, what is, like, for example, what is your character, the hero of the story? What are they up against? And how does that relate to the audience you're speaking to? What are the, test, allies, and the enemies that they experience through the story that you've put together? What does it mean for the audience? You don't need to especially with fiction, you're not trying to explain the book in a way that does, I would say, isn't true to the art. You don't want to have an epilogue where you explain the entire story. But what story are you inviting people into? And so in some ways, fiction, it has the power to connect a lot more because you're already telling a story, and now you get to invite the listener into that story from a different angle than you wrote the book from.
Yeah, yeah, so true. We're gonna have we have some time for questions here. So if you have a question, just ping me through the chat, and then I'll ask you to unmute the question. So sort of poking the bear or the elephant in the room, Michael, is speaking an art or a gift?
Yes. um, just like writing is an art and a gift. There are authors that I read and they use such pedestrian language, but I see the way they assemble a sentence and think, man, that's a gift. I mean, there's just like Chaim Potok is one of my favorite authors. And you read him and how he weaves a narrative and puts together a story. You're like, obviously, he was given something. And beyond that, you also know that he didn't just rely on the gift, but he did a ton of work to hone that gift. And I think that's what makes it the art is there's a lot of gifted people out there, but it's the ones who put in the time, who seek feedback, who seek input, who pursue people who are better than them. So the first time I ever spoke publicly, I was 22. Is that right? Yeah, 22 years old. It was 1998. And when I was done, my girlfriend at that time, who's now my wife, said, I didn't know you could do that. Did you? And I said, no, I had no idea. And I pursued every single speaker that I admired and looked up to and would spend hours and hours and hours with them, asking every question I could think to ask about how they did what they did and why they moved here on the stage and why did you assemble the speech that way. And then when I studied screenwriting and went to film school, I began to see this narrative piece that was missing in a lot of talks that I heard. So I began pursuing screenwriters saying, if you were going to give a talk, would you ever assemble it the way you assembled the screenplay, and why, and what would you do, and why did you, when you wrote the screenplay, do it this way? And I think that's where that the gift and art collide. And for those who say like, well, I'm not a good speaker, it doesn't mean you can't still grow and allow it to be an art form, because I think the best talks, the best speeches, the best keynotes come from a place of experience and authenticity, not just from a perfectly polished place. I've heard several speakers who are incredibly polished and they're absolute jerks. You can tell it in 3 minutes. I've also seen people who are not incredibly polished, but are pretty strong. And they have everybody either in gales of laughter or tears, and they're holding everybody with them because they show up authentically in their own voice because they've done the work.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I have known some authors I would request that they not speak publicly, but that's okay. That's for another day. Um, Katie, Katie Hudson, joining us from Nashville. Go ahead and unmute, Katie.
Hi, Michael.
Hi.
I'm curious. So I'm writing a book and I have 14 months to go, and I've done a few speaking engagements, and it feels a little wild and crazy, but I think I love your hunch, because my hunch is that I'm really enjoying doing speaking engagements to hone my book. I mean, I guess there's the question of, I suppose I should be doing pre-orders if I'm doing that, or getting mailing lists or something along the way. But I'm really enjoying the feedback that I'm started a Substack just now too. But those avenues along the way, other than building audience, are helping me make my book better. But what do you think about speaking in that process? Because I mean, I am honing ideas as I go. Do you have any experience with that? I'm chewing on how much to pursue it while I'm working on this.
Yeah, well, I wonder, are you someone who is an external processor or an internal processor?
I'm an external processor.
Yeah, which is why the speaking might really be helpful for you
Yeah, this
because
is
you're floating ideas. Sounds like you're floating ideas out there and seeing what lands and what works.
yeah. I'm bringing a lot of, well, I'm writing a book about play for one thing, so it feels fitting to play with others in the process. it feels weird to do it in a vacuum. So I'm
Yeah.
talking to a lot of people, but also, yeah, that's really helping me.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, the fellow that Don had on video when we started, I'm betting is an introvert, just by the way he presented and talked about being, what was it, 8 hours in a room with people he's made up. I'm much more introverted. So my book writing process was, I had done a ton of speaking before and I brought in some of the themes from there, but I needed hours with books and research and time and alone. And then I'd go out and invite people, give me feedback. So
Mhm.
I think some of it is really dependent on how you're wired. And I would say anytime you go out and speak, this is probably the most practical advice I can give. There's a really great tool called Talkadot, TALKADOT.com. And it's a wonderful way. You just ask people at the end of your talk, hey, I'm always trying to get better as a speaker. If you have any feedback for me, and they give you a QR code, you get their name, email, feedback, and then a question like, are you an event planner? Do you know people who need a speaker? Do you want me to come and speak? So you get built-in leads, but then you also build a mailing list. I know authors who also do this. They'll put up the QR code and it's just a link right to their website where there's a request to sign up for the newsletter. So if you're speaking and not building a mailing list, that needs to change fast. So my mailing list now is, I don't know, it's somewhere in the thousands because I've really, really worked hard to get people to sign up and to connect. And it makes it that much better. And you know now who's interested in your message.
That's
Is that
great.
helpful?
That's really helpful. Thanks. Yeah, I've got, you just gave me a list of chores. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great.
Kyle, let's go to you, please. Kyle's
Hey, thank
his great American novel and also has Hollywood chasing him down.
you. That's so kind of you to say, Don. We'll see if it's legitimate, but yes, lot of good stuff going on. First of all, I'm really passionate about this topic. I'm an extrovert, and I was a stand-up comedian before I started writing. And so that part of it I love and I enjoy. Like that's not the hard part. The concern I had, and this is one of the things Don and I had to talk about when I started working with him, was my book did start off as a memoir, but I found there was not only more fulfillment, but there was also more exposition to be had about fictionalizing my story. I've always been concerned does that soften the impact because there's a very real message in my book for very real people that experienced what I experienced. So that's kind of the first part. Do you think it softens the impact? And B, if not, how to, as a fiction writer who fictionalized a very real, painful story, what are some good ways to communicate that to people? Because the speaking part is the fun part for me, but I'm kind of just worried about maybe losing the impact because it's been fictionalized.
Well, my first thought, Kyle, is like people still cry at fiction movies. And so the question is, why? I mean, we know it didn't happen. We know these people are made up, but people still weep. And so I think that's more, maybe it's a question for your own sense. Um, what are you more comfortable with? People knowing your story or people seeing someone who can write what is fiction based on obviously real circumstances? And is that how you want to connect with them? And whatever the answer is internally for you, I would say go with that. And again, I go back to, I think one of my mentors told me people can tell in 90 seconds whether or not you're authentic. And so I think that's the same thing for reading a book. You can get in and be like, this is absolute rubbish. Um, but I think authenticity is a way of also coming off the page pretty quickly. So that would be the first thought I have. The second part you were asking about speaking. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, just a way. Are there specific ways? It sounds like you actually kind of answered that. It sounds like it's rooted in authenticity. My concern was if it doesn't soften the blow, ways to communicate it that can connect the fiction to the reality and still have a powerful message for people that can glean things from it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think there's a fellow named Richard Rohr. He's a Franciscan priest that speaks about the authority of those who've suffered. And I think if you come in after having written this book And your talk is, I wrote with the authority of one who suffered. And you don't have to use that phrase, although it's pretty great. Richard Rohr has a lot of great one-liners, but there's something immediately where this guy knows the pain that we're talking about. I mentioned Chaim Potok earlier in his book, The Chosen. The Gift of Asher Lev. There's a lot of biographical stuff in that, and I don't know if you're familiar with him or if you've read that book, but I knew before I read the book that some of his story was in it, and it made it so much more powerful. And so I think if people hear you speak out of that personal place, reflecting on this work of fiction, all of a sudden when they pick it up, they're not hearing a story about some made up character. They're reading ultimately your story and how you're processing it, dealing with it. And because there's a level of separation between the fiction story and yours, it also can invite them more deeply into their own story to join with the characters that they're reading about. And I think you can do that in the talk as well. And by the way, you're my hero if you've done stand-up. That's like one of my goals. It's terrifying, but yeah, it's I love stand-up comedy. So well
I'm still scarred from it, so deep scars. But thank you for your answer. That actually brought a lot of relief to me about something I've been concerned about. So thank you. That helped a lot.
Awesome.
Callie Murray joining us from somewhere in Georgia.
Hey, actually, Kyle, I have something to say to you first, if that's okay. One of my favorite fiction authors lost her husband young, and her kind of breakout novel was a rom-com where the main character falls in love after losing her husband. And in her author's note, she said something about the story is fiction, but the grief is mine. And that just really stuck with me. And I feel like kind of gave me the freedom even to take that suffering that Michael mentioned and like fictionalize it, but it's still your suffering.
That's incredible. Thank you for sharing that. That's huge.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And that author is Emma Gray.
Yes. Emma Gray, The Last Love Note is that book. It's so good. Hey, Michael, question for you. Your answer is probably going to be, it depends, but when do you charge for speaking versus when do you just like gladly show up and try and sell some books? How do you kind of find that balance?
Yeah, it depends.
Great. Next.
Yeah. No, I think, well, let me speak to church world first. And I don't know all of your faith backgrounds, but there's this kind of unstated thing in a lot of churches, Christian nonprofits, of we're doing this work to suffer, which means we're going to pay you crap. And the good news is that's beginning to change. So we've never skirted. One of the first things I do as when someone is coming to speak for us is I name the honorarium immediately and then say, where does that line up with your pay or what you normally charge for a fee? Or I'll start with, what's your fee? This is what we normally pay. So I don't think it's wrong at all, especially if you're traveling, to incur airfare, lodging, all the incidentals, travel expenses. And some will say, well, we'll let you sell your book and that will pay. But you might be walking into a congregation of 175 people and only sell 10 books, and that's not going to pay. So know that in the church world, because people know it's a bit weird, honestly, if you don't make it weird and you bring that right up front, you're going to get an answer pretty quickly. And then at that point, the decision is up to you whether or not you want to incur the expenses yourself to get your book out there and your message out there. The second piece is if you're going and speaking out to companies or at a conference or doing, like I've done C-level days away with different companies. And I always just say, here's my fee. And then I'm quiet. I don't say, but I can do X, Y, Z, or if you need me to. And I always have a standard discount for nonprofits just because I've lived in that world for so long and I know the work they do. But I've started saying no for people who want me to come in free, especially if they're a company, because I know the money that they have. And I think it's really learning to believe and trust I'm worth this. And also then making sure, this is an important piece, especially in the conference circuit, if they ask you don't sell, you can ask for a booth in the back with your book. But if you get out on the conference circuit one time and you violate that request, you will get blacklisted immediately. And the world of event planners is small. I know several people who've gone out with a book and dropped it. I mean, made their whole talk wrap around the book. And it was the last talk they gave. So you can ask in the intro for them to mention your book. But that's a really important piece to be aware of. But I would say, if you're out there speaking, if you have a strong message, it's worth the money.
Thank you.
I'm going to go to Laura, which is kind of a piggyback to this question that Callie had. So go ahead, Laura.
Thank you, Don, and thank you, Michael, for being here. This is invaluable. So thankful.
Good.
So, Michael, I'm in Boulder, Colorado, and so I'm just right down the road from you. I am entering the speaking world in churches, but I'm curious of how do you think we get our net wide? And that, because I'm speaking at churches where I know the pastor's wife, or I know, the church personally, but I would love to speak. I mean, I'm a better speaker than a writer. Don will know that, or does know that. But speaking is my passion. But how do you cast that net wide? And then do you have any advice for women? Because it is a tricky.
Yes, it is. Thankfully, that tide is changing. The person who stepped into the lead pastor role at Denver Community Church after me is a woman. And so I love that. And actually, Laura, can you email me?
Yeah.
I'd love to have a conversation. I'd love to learn more about you. But let me answer your question specifically. A couple of things. One is get to Christian conferences, because those are the ones that are attended by pastors. So I'm thinking, there's the big ones like Exponential, and everyone's like, oh, I would never get there. But Exponential has a ton of breakout sessions. I think they bring in like 400 speakers every year, and that feels overwhelming. Like, oh, I'm just one of 400. But if you get in front of 30 people, that's 30 people. So that's one piece. The other thing is look for networks. And so in the Protestant world, especially non-mainline Protestant world, as denominations are shrinking, networks are growing. And so you have churches that are connected to networks all over the place. I do know there are some that honestly just wouldn't have a woman come speak, which I have my strong opinions about that, but I don't know who I'm on with, so I'll just say it that way. And from there, once you get into the networks, when I started getting out, I just said, who are 2 or 3 people you would be willing to introduce me to? Can you give me their names? And at that point, I was still pastoring, and so it felt a little slimy to push people like that, but I got over it. And so I think that's one piece. I think the other piece specifically around women, and I'm reflecting what I've heard from the women on our staff, is oftentimes they had to really calibrate what would be the receptivity if I showed up and talked. So at a church like ours, we've had our last 3 teaching pastors have all been women, and I only teach 20 weeks a year. So they're very familiar with the feminine voice. And so in that case, it'd be okay. There's other churches where, I hate to say it, but it's like, well, we have a woman teaching, and it almost feels like a downshift, which I think is absolute trash. Wisdom is always personified as a woman in the Bible, by the way. That's true. So I think that's a really important thing for you to evaluate as best you can. Am I coming into a place that's open and excited to hear from me? Or is it like, oh, they're going to tolerate a woman's voice? And that's a decision only you can make. But I think it's a really important one to be aware of. And I'd love to hear more of you and your story. And since we're so close, and make introductions as I'm able.
Thank you so much. I'll be thinking about you. The first 90 seconds of my talk, I am preaching this week in Los Alamos, New Mexico, and it'll be the first time this church has ever had a woman on a Sunday morning. in 7 years.
Yes. I love it. I absolutely love it. Well done.
Thank you.
Michael, to piggyback on this question, I think Rachel had a question and Kelly's question. At what point is it wise to engage a speakers bureau? Outreach Magazine has their Outreach Speakers Bureau. Is that at what point would you say that's worthwhile, or do you lean into the networks as you've suggested?
I think it can be both. Here's what I know about speakers bureaus. So there's speakers agencies and there's speaker bureaus. What I'm learning about the bureaus is they put up your information and wait for people to come shopping. So one of my acquaintances runs, I can't remember the name of it. I think it's Big Speak. And they have like Magic Johnson on there and actors and actresses. I'm like, and I know people that are in that and excited. And I'm like, you are never going to get a gig through that, because if people are getting on there and they see the Magic Johnsons of this world, I think Hillary Clinton is one of their clients, they're not going to scroll down to you. Speaker agencies, they'll do a little bit more shopping for you. And so, I mean, it's like a literary agent. So when Don takes your manuscript, he's shopping it to publishers. Speaker agencies will shop you to conferences, and they have the event planners and everything else. Bureaus are much more of just they post your profile and most of them you sit and wait. There's a great speakers agency that launched here in Denver. I'm friends with the woman who founded it, called Voice Quest. I'm happy to make any introductions that you all might want, and you can learn a lot about the speaker business from her. Her name is actually Jasmine Rice, which that's not a joke. And she often tells me that people say, that name sounds familiar. And she says, well, that's because you've probably eaten Jasmine Rice. But she's wonderful and she works with authors, she works with people of faith, she works with people across the board, but really does a good job of trying to get speakers' names out there and connected.
That's good. Dave Moja, we have one last chance for you. Go ahead.
Thanks, Don. And Michael, thanks for being here, man. Great stuff. This is wonderful.
Thank you.
Real quick, and I'm not totally sure how to ask the question, but for folks who have some experience speaking, kind of to one arena or one group for years and years and years, and now changing gears, speaking to another vastly different audience. Hacks, tips, hints on, you research, I know you go there and that kind of thing, but you can get real accustomed and experienced and trained on one way of going about things. But are there videos to watch or ideas or a checklist or anything like that for trying to make that change?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have, on one of the workshops I do, I think it's 6 or 7 questions to ask about your audience before you ever stand up in front of them. And it's really, audience analysis and psychology is fascinating. But the good news is this: people are people. So whether you're speaking to a church, whether you're speaking to a company, whether you're speaking at a conference, the same things are going to connect with people. And ultimately, it sounds so simple and cliche, but it's stories. I have a friend who says, human beings are story-driven creatures. We don't dream in mathematical equations. We dream in stories. Although she started pointing out that a few people have said that they actually dream in equations. Most of them are engineers or physicists, but this is one of the reasons I'm really passionate about crafting the narrative as a story. It's the reason why we still watch films, even though they're now north of 3 hours. It's the reason why we binge watch Netflix. It's stories grab onto us. And if we can learn who the audience is, we're going to begin sorting and understanding what stories are going to play. So if you're speaking to a group of veterans and you're going to know some things about them. Anytime that I go speak somewhere, whether it's a church or whether it's a conference, whoever is hosting me, in my contract, they have to have a 45-minute meeting with me about 3 weeks before the speaking engagement. And ask them every question I can think about their audience. It's like a demographic study. And then I say, is there anything stressful that I should know about? I was going to speak at a conference one time, and I found out the CEO of one of the big sponsors, his wife had just passed away from cancer 3 weeks before, and everyone knew. And they mentioned that. And I happened to have in my talk at that point a story about someone passing away from cancer. And I pulled that thing out immediately. I was like, nope. So it really is, in so many ways, audience to audience, and then framing the story for them in a way that they can hear it and receive it.
So good. Michael, thank you for being with us today. I'm always respectful of the 45-minute time limit here, to honor everyone that's joining and giving up their morning. Before we go, you have a room full of, or a cube full, a Zoom full of authors, writers. What words of encouragement or wisdom can you give to writers today?
Yeah, I would say never stop the internal work. We don't need more clever stories. We need greater wisdom and depth and healing and wholeness in our world. And the written word and the spoken word are unbelievably important to that, especially in this division that we're experiencing politically, socially, religiously. Was surprising in 2016, and 9 years later, it's just a part of the fabric of who we are. And I think the world needs people that are transcendent, that are inviting people to a bigger story, and that cannot begin until that story takes root in you. So that's what I'd say. Continue the internal work. And your books, your speeches, your talks, your words, as Abraham Joshua Heschel said, words create worlds, and you can create a new world for people if you do that work.
So good. If we were in church, we'd take up an offering right now. But we're not. Michael, it's always good to see your face. I look forward to Cuba sometime soon.
Yes, my friend. Thank you.
Yeah. Have a good rest of your day. Folks,
I will.
thank you for joining. We've got next month, we've got 2 Zooms, one a special one. Callie, why don't you tell us about the June 5th one that's happening?
Yeah, the thought here was just to give us all a chance to get to know one another. I told Dawn, I sit here and just like Google people's names when we're on these calls. And so if you're able to join, we'd love to have you. We'll talk. I mean, we'll get to hear from everyone, kind of hear what you're working on. I've got a couple questions in mind. I'll also share a Google spreadsheet with everyone so we can kind of drop in newsletters and all that. So would love to have you.
And then our regularly scheduled third Thursday of the month is June 19. And we've got Ben Smith, who's going to join us from DC, Washington, DC. He's a social media guru. He's going to talk about Instagram, how we can optimize that as authors for all kinds of things, Instagram Live and all that. And then this just in, which is kind of fun, in October Zoom, our guest is going to be Leif Enger, who wrote Peace Like a River and Virgil Wander and a whole bunch of other good books. He will be our guest in October. So lots of good things on the horizon. Thank you, every one of you, for joining today. Have a good rest of your day. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, everybody. Grace and peace.